In the year 9 BC, when the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power under Emperor Augustus, a young man named Marcus Valerius lived with his family in a small settlement in northern Italy. Rome had changed greatly during the lifetime of his father. The old Roman Republic, with its competing senators, ambitious generals, and endless political struggles, had disappeared after decades of civil war. Augustus, the adopted son and heir of Julius Caesar, had become the first emperor, although he carefully avoided calling himself a king. Throughout the empire, roads were being repaired, cities expanded, temples restored, and Roman soldiers guarded the frontiers. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about Rome's victories. His grandfather had fought during the final years of the Republic, and had returned home with scars on his shoulder and a small bronze military decoration. To Marcus, the Roman army seemed almost larger than life. He imagined its soldiers marching beneath the famous standards, their shields shining in the sun, their red cloaks moving in the wind, and the golden eagle of the legion carried proudly at the front. His father, however, did not romanticize military life. He knew that a soldier could spend years far from home, sleeping on hard ground, building roads and fortifications, carrying heavy equipment, and fighting enemies whose names Marcus had barely heard. Still, when Marcus reached the required age, he decided that he wanted to join. He traveled to a nearby Roman military settlement where recruiters examined his health, questioned him about his family, and measured his physical condition. The Roman army did not simply accept every man who wanted to become a soldier. Discipline and endurance were essential. Marcus was accepted into the legion and took the military oath of loyalty. From that moment, his life changed. He was no longer simply the son of a farmer. He had become part of Rome's enormous military machine. His training was harsh. Every morning began before sunrise. New recruits learned to march long distances while carrying weapons, armor, food, tools, and other equipment. They practiced with wooden swords that were heavier than ordinary weapons, so that their real swords would feel lighter in battle. They trained with shields, learned formations, and practiced throwing the famous Roman javelin called the pilum. Their instructors constantly shouted at them, correcting the smallest mistakes. A soldier who failed to maintain formation could place his entire unit in danger. Marcus quickly discovered that courage alone was not enough. Roman warfare depended upon organization. A legion was divided into smaller units, and every soldier had a position. Orders had to be understood immediately. The army also taught its soldiers to build. A Roman army did not simply march into an area and establish camp wherever it wished. At the end of a day's march, soldiers could construct a fortified camp, with ditches, walls, gates, and defensive positions. Marcus was astonished by how quickly hundreds or thousands of men could transform an open field into a military settlement. The discipline was exhausting, but slowly he became stronger. His hands developed calluses, his shoulders became accustomed to carrying heavy equipment, and his feet hardened from endless marching. During evenings, soldiers talked about their homes, their families, and the distant lands they had seen. Some had been born in Italy, while others came from provinces throughout the empire. Rome's army was becoming increasingly diverse. Men from Gaul, Spain, the Balkans, North Africa, and other regions could serve under Roman standards. Marcus learned that being Roman was not always about being born in the city of Rome. The empire was becoming a vast world, connected by roads, military camps, trade, laws, and Roman institutions. After months of training, Marcus was assigned to a legion stationed near the northern frontier. He had never traveled so far from home. As the soldiers marched north, he saw landscapes different from the countryside of Italy. Forests stretched across the horizon, rivers divided the land, and villages appeared beyond the Roman roads. The further he traveled, the more Marcus understood why Rome needed such a powerful army. The empire was enormous, and its borders were never completely peaceful. His first sight of the legionary eagle affected him deeply. The eagle was more than a piece of metal mounted on a pole. To the soldiers, it represented the honor and identity of the legion itself. Losing it to an enemy would be a terrible disgrace. Marcus stared at it as the standard-bearer carried it through the camp. He wondered whether he would someday be brave enough to defend it with his life. At that moment, he still believed that the greatest danger would come from an enemy army standing openly on a battlefield. He did not yet understand that the most dangerous moments for Roman soldiers could occur in forests, during ambushes, or while marching through unfamiliar territory. The Roman Empire appeared almost invincible, but Marcus was about to discover that even Rome could suffer a terrible defeat. Several years later, Marcus's legion was stationed in Germania, east of the Rhine. Rome had attempted to extend its influence beyond the river, and Roman commanders believed that the Germanic peoples could eventually be brought under Roman authority. Roman forts and roads had begun appearing in the region, and some local leaders cooperated with Rome while others resisted. Marcus had now become an experienced soldier. The nervous recruit who had once struggled to carry his equipment had disappeared. He could march for hours without complaint, construct a camp quickly, and respond to commands almost instinctively. Yet Germania remained a difficult land for Roman armies. Dense forests made movement difficult, rivers frequently flooded, and local tribes understood the terrain far better than Roman soldiers did. Marcus had heard stories about Germanic warriors, but many Roman officers considered them disorganized compared with Roman legions. The empire's confidence would soon be tested. In the autumn of AD 9, the Roman governor Publius Quinctilius Varus received reports that a rebellion had begun among several Germanic communities. Varus decided to march his army toward the troubled region. Among those accompanying him was Arminius, a Germanic leader who had previously served with Rome and understood Roman military methods. Arminius had earned Roman citizenship and military experience, which made him appear trustworthy to many Roman commanders. Marcus did not know him personally, but he had seen Germanic auxiliaries serving alongside Roman forces. The Roman column moved through the forest under increasingly unpleasant conditions. Rain turned paths into mud. The soldiers struggled to maintain formation, as trees and narrow roots restricted movement. Unlike an open battlefield, the forest did not provide Roman commanders with a clear view of the surrounding land. Then the attacks began. Germanic warriors emerged from the trees, throwing spears and retreating before the Romans could organize a complete response. Roman soldiers tried to form defensive lines, but the terrain made it difficult. Marcus heard horns and shouting from different directions. Arrows and spears appeared from the forest. The Romans attempted to advance, but their long column was stretched across the landscape. The enemy knew where to attack and where to disappear. Marcus and his comrades fought desperately to protect their standards and maintain formation. Their training kept them alive. They formed ranks whenever the terrain allowed, and used their shields to protect themselves from missiles. But the Romans were trapped in an environment that favored their opponents. Over the next days, the situation became catastrophic. Heavy rain continued, equipment became damaged, and Roman soldiers struggled to move through the forest. The Germanic coalition grew stronger, while the Roman column became increasingly disorganized. Marcus saw men who had fought bravely fall around him. He realized that the Roman army's reputation could not protect a soldier from a spear thrown from behind a tree. Discipline remained essential, but discipline could not remove every disadvantage. The Roman commander Varus eventually understood that the army was facing disaster. The Roman forces suffered enormous losses in what became known as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. 3 Roman legions were destroyed, along with auxiliary troops and camp followers. The disaster shocked the Roman world. For Marcus, the battle became the defining experience of his life. He survived, but many of the men with whom he had trained did not. The legionary standards were lost, and Roman prestige suffered a major blow. The defeat demonstrated that Rome's power had limits. The Emperor Augustus was deeply affected by the news. Ancient sources later reported that he repeatedly lamented the loss of the legions, calling for the lost standards to be recovered. Rome responded by strengthening the Rhine frontier, rather than attempting to conquer all of Germania. Marcus eventually returned west of the Rhine with the surviving Roman forces. He was older now, and the confidence he had once possessed had been replaced by caution. He no longer believed that victory was guaranteed simply because a soldier wore Roman armor. He had learned that geography, intelligence, leadership, weather, and political alliances could determine the fate of armies. The Teutoburg disaster also changed Roman strategy. The Rhine became one of the most important defensive boundaries of the empire. Rome continued to campaign beyond it at various times, but permanent conquest of Germania east of the Rhine was abandoned. Marcus spent years afterwards serving along the frontier. He watched new forts rise along the river, roads being repaired, and soldiers arriving from distant provinces. Rome had survived its defeat. That was perhaps the greatest lesson he learned. The empire could lose armies, territories, and battles, and still recover. Rome's strength was not simply the courage of its soldiers, it was its ability to rebuild, reorganize, and continue. Marcus eventually became one of the older men in his unit. Younger soldiers asked him about the famous battle in the German forests. He rarely described it in detail. Instead, he told them that a Roman soldier should never underestimate an enemy, never ignore the land around him, and never believe that victory was guaranteed. The eagle had survived elsewhere, but several Roman eagles had been lost in Germania. Marcus understood that the symbol of Rome could inspire soldiers, but it was human beings who had to carry it. Decades passed, and the Roman Empire continued to expand and prosper. Marcus eventually retired from military service after completing many years in the army. He received the privileges associated with honorable service and returned to Italy, but the world he came home to seemed very different from the one he had left. Under emperors who followed Augustus, Rome became increasingly wealthy and powerful. The empire stretched from Britain in the northwest to Egypt in the southeast, and from the Atlantic Ocean to the lands surrounding the Euphrates. Roman roads connected distant provinces, merchants traveled between cities, and ships carried grain, wine, olive oil, metals, and other goods across the Mediterranean. Rome itself had become an enormous city. Temples, forums, baths, markets, theaters, and public buildings filled its streets. Marcus visited Rome and stood beneath monuments that seemed almost impossible to build. The Colosseum, begun under Emperor Vespasian and completed under his son Titus, became one of the most famous structures in the Roman world. Thousands of spectators could gather there to watch gladiatorial contests and other spectacles. Marcus did not find the arena as glorious as some citizens described it. He saw the excitement of the crowd, but he also saw wounded men and understood that behind the entertainment was real suffering. Roman society was complicated. The empire provided roads, aqueducts, laws, public baths, markets, and military security, yet it also depended heavily upon slavery and social inequality. Wealthy senators lived in enormous houses, while poor citizens often crowded into apartment buildings. Enslaved people worked in households, farms, mines, workshops, and other parts of the economy. Marcus had spent much of his life thinking about Rome as a military power, but now he began to understand that the empire was supported by much more than soldiers. Farmers produced food, craftsmen manufactured goods, merchants transported products, engineers built roads and aqueducts, administrators collected taxes, and local governments maintained cities. Roman citizenship itself was changing. Over generations, citizenship had spread to people in many provinces. A man could be born far from Italy and still become deeply connected to Roman political and cultural life. Marcus met veterans from Syria, Spain, Gaul, North Africa, and the Balkans. They spoke different languages and came from different traditions, but they could serve in the same army and live under Roman law. The empire was not culturally uniform. Local religions and customs continued alongside Roman institutions. In some provinces, Roman and local traditions blended together. Marcus found this fascinating because his grandfather had imagined Rome as a single city ruling distant peoples, while Marcus now saw something larger, an empire made up of many communities. During his retirement, Marcus often visited a military friend who had settled near the Italian coast. Together they discussed how much Rome had changed. They remembered the fear of Germania, the harsh marches, and the soldiers who never returned. Their conversations often turned toward the future. Could Rome remain powerful forever? Marcus did not know. The empire seemed enormous, but history had taught him that no political system was guaranteed to survive unchanged. He remembered the Roman Republic, which his father had described as the natural order of the world. Yet the Republic had disappeared within a generation. Marcus wondered whether the empire might someday experience a similar transformation. For the moment, however, Rome seemed secure. The frontiers were guarded by hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Cities flourished. Trade continued across the Mediterranean. Roman law influenced communities throughout the empire. The emperor's authority was recognized across vast territories. Marcus's grandchildren grew up, knowing almost nothing about the old republic. To them, the emperor was simply part of the natural political order. Marcus sometimes told them stories about the old days, but they preferred stories about soldiers, battles, and distant lands. One evening, his eldest grandson asked him why he had spent so many years in the army. Marcus looked toward the sunset and answered that he had once believed he was serving only Rome. With age, however, he realized that he had also served the people beside him. A legion was not an abstract idea. It was thousands of individuals who depended upon one another. The empire's monuments could survive for centuries, but individual soldiers disappeared quickly. Marcus had learned that history was made not only by emperors and generals, but also by ordinary people whose names were forgotten. He spent his final years writing down what he remembered. He did not claim that his story represented all of Rome. Instead, he wanted his descendants to understand that the Roman Empire had been built by countless people whose lives were rarely recorded. When Marcus finally died, his family buried him according to the customs of his community. His military decorations were kept as family possessions. The world continued without him. Emperors changed, armies marched, cities grew, and new generations were born. Rome remained powerful, but Marcus's life had taught his family one important truth. Even the greatest empire was made from ordinary human lives. Many generations after Marcus's death, the Roman Empire entered a period of increasing difficulty. The empire did not suddenly collapse, as stories sometimes suggest. Instead, it experienced centuries of political struggles, economic pressures, civil wars, frontier conflicts, and administrative changes. In the 3rd century AD, several emperors ruled for short periods, and armies sometimes fought against other Roman armies to decide who would control the empire. Germanic peoples crossed Roman frontiers, while Persian rulers challenged Roman power in the east. The empire was enormous, and defending every border required tremendous resources. Eventually, Emperor Diocletian introduced major reforms. He reorganized administration and divided imperial authority among several rulers in a system known as the Tetrarchy. The empire became more heavily bureaucratic and militarized. Later, Constantine emerged as a dominant emperor and founded a new imperial center at Constantinople. Christianity also became increasingly important within Roman society. Constantine's reign marked a major transformation, although the Roman state remained Roman in its laws, institutions, army, and political traditions. As the 4th century progressed, the empire continued to face pressure. The movement of peoples across Europe changed the political landscape. In AD 376, large numbers of Goths entered Roman territory, partly because of pressure from the Huns. Relations between the newcomers and Roman authorities deteriorated, eventually leading to conflict. In AD 378, the Roman army suffered a devastating defeat at Adrianople, where Emperor Valens was killed. Yet Rome survived this disaster as well. The empire continued for another century in the west, and much longer in the east. By the 5th century, however, the western provinces faced enormous challenges. Roman armies increasingly relied upon soldiers recruited from different peoples, while powerful military commanders competed for influence. Economic resources became harder to control, and several regions experienced invasions or political fragmentation. In AD 410, the Visigoths under Alaric entered and sacked Rome. The event shocked the Mediterranean world, because Rome itself had rarely been captured in such a dramatic way. Yet the empire did not end immediately. Rome remained politically significant, and imperial government continued. In AD 455, the city was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. The Western Empire continued to weaken. In AD 476, the Germanic military leader Odoacer removed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus from power. Historians often use this event as the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire, although the exact meaning of the date is debated. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for nearly another 1,000 years. Its people continued to call themselves Romans, and its rulers claimed the legacy of the ancient empire. Constantinople became one of the greatest cities of the medieval world. Roman law continued to influence governments, and Roman military traditions evolved rather than disappearing overnight. In Italy and elsewhere, former Roman territories developed new kingdoms and political structures. The Roman world had changed, but its legacy remained. Roads built by Roman engineers continued to be used. Roman bridges and aqueducts survived in various places. Latin evolved into several languages, including Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Roman law influenced European legal traditions. Roman architectural ideas inspired later builders. The Latin alphabet spread widely. Even political concepts associated with Roman citizenship, administration, and republican government continued to influence later societies. The story of Rome, therefore, cannot be reduced to a simple rise and fall. It was a transformation lasting more than 1,000 years. A traveler walking through former Roman lands centuries after the empire's western political collapse could still encounter Roman walls, roads, inscriptions, coins, churches, and ruins. The physical remains reminded people that a powerful civilization had once connected enormous territories. The story of Marcus and his descendants became only one tiny thread in that history. No monument recorded his name, and no emperor knew about his life. Yet the Roman Empire depended upon men like him. Soldiers guarded frontiers, farmers supplied armies, craftsmen built equipment, engineers constructed roads, and families raised new generations. Rome was not created by one person. Julius Caesar had been important. Augustus had transformed the political system, and later emperors had shaped the empire. But millions of ordinary people made Roman society function. That is why the history of Rome remains so powerful. Its story is not simply about emperors sitting on thrones or generals winning battles. It is about a civilization that changed over centuries while leaving an enormous influence on the world. The Roman Empire disappeared as a political structure in the West, but Rome did not simply vanish. Its language, laws, architecture, institutions, religious history, military traditions, and cultural influence survived in countless forms. The eagle standards of the legions were gone. The old imperial armies had disappeared, and the great political system of the Western Empire had fragmented. Yet the memory of Rome remained. Centuries later, people would still study its battles, debate its emperors, walk through its ruins, and read the works of its writers. Rome became more than an empire. It became a historical legacy. Centuries after Marcus and the soldiers of his generation had disappeared, a historian traveling through the ruins of the ancient Roman world might have wondered how such a civilization could have left such enormous traces behind. The old military camps had become ruins, but their walls could still be recognized. Roman roads continued to cross landscapes that had changed dramatically since the imperial age. In some cities, fragments of Roman buildings were incorporated into medieval structures. Latin inscriptions survived on stones, coins, monuments, and tombs. The Roman Empire was no longer politically united, but its memory remained remarkably powerful. The story of Rome had begun centuries before Marcus was born, when a small community on the Italian peninsula gradually grew into a republic. Rome expanded through alliances, warfare, political organization, and colonization. It defeated powerful rivals such as Carthage, and eventually became dominant throughout the Mediterranean. The Republic produced remarkable statesmen, generals, writers, and philosophers, but it also suffered from social inequality, political violence, and civil war. Julius Caesar's rise demonstrated how military power could challenge traditional republican institutions. After Caesar's assassination, further civil wars eventually brought Augustus to power. Under Augustus and his successors, Rome became an empire whose territory stretched across much of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. But Rome's strength was never simply military. The Romans developed systems of administration capable of governing diverse populations. They built roads that allowed armies and merchants to travel quickly. Aqueducts supplied cities with water. Bridges connected distant regions. Legal institutions provided common frameworks for many communities. Roman citizenship gradually expanded, reaching a much broader population than it had during the early Republic. The empire was also influenced by the cultures it conquered. Rome adopted and transformed ideas from Greece, Egypt, Syria, Gaul, Spain, and many other regions. Roman civilization was therefore not isolated. It was a mixture created through centuries of contact between different peoples. The Roman army was perhaps the clearest example of this diversity. The soldiers who marched under Roman standards came from many backgrounds. Some were citizens from Italy, while others came from provinces that had once been independent kingdoms or tribal territories. They spoke different languages before joining the military, and worshipped different gods according to their traditions. Yet within the army they learned common commands, followed common discipline, and served under Roman standards. Marcus's story, although fictional, represents the experiences that thousands of real Roman soldiers may have encountered: long marches, military camps, frontier duty, fear, friendship, homesickness, and the uncertainty of war. Their individual stories were rarely recorded, but their collective actions helped shape history. Eventually, however, no army could prevent the empire from changing. Political divisions, economic problems, civil wars, external migrations, and changing military structures gradually transformed the Roman world. The Western Empire disappeared as a unified political authority, but the Eastern Roman state survived for centuries. Even after Constantinople eventually fell in 1453, the Roman legacy continued. Medieval and modern societies repeatedly looked back toward Rome for examples of government, law, architecture, military organization, and political authority. Modern roads sometimes follow routes that Roman engineers established nearly 2,000 years ago. Modern languages descended from Latin. Legal systems around the world contain concepts influenced by Roman law. Government buildings often imitate Roman architectural forms. The very word empire carries memories of Rome. Yet perhaps the most important lesson of Roman history is that power is temporary. Rome once seemed unstoppable. Its armies crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers. Its ships dominated the Mediterranean. Its emperors ruled enormous territories. But even Rome changed, weakened, and eventually divided. The ruins that remain today are reminders that human achievements can survive long after the political systems that created them have disappeared. Marcus could never have imagined that people thousands of years later would study the world in which he lived. He would not have known that historians would examine Roman military camps, inscriptions, coins, weapons, roads, and ancient writings to reconstruct the lives of people like him. He would probably have thought only about his family, his comrades, and the next day's march. Yet that is precisely what makes ancient history fascinating. Great historical changes are experienced by ordinary people one day at a time. An empire may appear in history books as a giant political structure, but inside that structure were farmers, soldiers, merchants, mothers, fathers, craftsmen, slaves, officials, children, and travelers. They lived, worked, loved, suffered, fought, and died, without knowing how later generations would remember them. The Roman eagle eventually disappeared from the battlefields of the ancient empire, but the idea of Rome survived. Its roads remained beneath later roads. Its laws influenced later governments. Its language developed into new languages. Its buildings became ruins that inspired new architecture. Its history became a subject studied by generations of people. The Roman Empire had ended, but Rome had not been forgotten. And perhaps that is why the story of Rome still feels alive today. The empire itself was temporary, but the traces left by its people became part of world history. The young soldier Marcus is fictional, but the world around him was real. The legions, the frontier, the roads, the camps, the cities, the emperors, and the immense civilization that Rome created and transformed. His imagined life represents the countless lives hidden behind the famous names of Roman history. Rome was built by millions, defended by millions, and remembered by millions. Its empire eventually disappeared, but its shadow continued across the centuries.